Medical examiner Charles Harlan, what was his reputation?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, I guess is the best way to answer that.
Did you know at the time that he was under investigation for
No.
anything?
No, I don't recall having that knowledge.
It turns out Dr. Harlan had already been under investigation for incompetence for years by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, but no one told James Suttle or his attorneys. As for the judge,
Did you know that he was under investigation, Dr. Harlan?
I'm not real sure he was under investigation at that time. So I'd have to say no, I didn't.
It turns out Dr. Harlan had been under investigation since 1996.
Okay, you asked me a moment ago, did I know he'd been under investigation? I don't think I did at that time.
No,
I may have.
now with Suttle's exoneration, long simmering rumors about Harlan and botched autopsies have reached a boiling point.
Allegations of improper conduct could cost Dr. Harlan his medical license.
He's brought up on charges of gross negligence by the Tennessee Medical Board.
Dr. Harlan faces 27 allegations of unprofessional conduct, fraud, and negligence.
There were 20-some-odd cases.
Bob O'Connell was the prosecutor in the hearing against Dr. Harlan.
It was tough to go through some of those things. It was tough as an attorney and as a human being for me to look at the pictures and to think about what happened.
Among the unbelievable charges, Dr. Harlan identified a dead body as belonging to this man, escaped convict Bruce Allen Littleton. 2 years later, Littleton was arrested, very much alive. Harlan said these two children died of SIDS, but both were later found to have been murdered by a parent. He said this child died of natural causes. The 10-year-old was emaciated and weighed only 18 pounds at death.
How you can draw the conclusion that this child had not been neglected is unfathomable to me.
During an autopsy in an important murder case, Harlan allowed his pet dog access to the autopsy room with devastating results.
It was apparent at some point that the dog apparently consumed some of the remains of human beings.
What organs did this dog?
Stop.
Medical examiner Charles Harlan, what was his organs did this dog eat?
The liver and the spleen,
His own dog.
his own dog.
It's that kind of detail in this case that gives me the shivers to this day. I mean, this man was allegedly a scientist.
In 2005, after 30 years as a medical examiner, Harlan is found guilty of 18 charges of incompetence and negligence, and finally, stripped of his license.
He wound up losing his license, Dr. Harlan.
Mm-hmm.
Was that enough punishment for him?
No, I don't think it's enough punishment for him. Well, if he's working in good faith, how do you change your testimony 4 or 5 times if you're working in good faith? To me, that don't sound like good faith.
Whose good faith is he working for?
It looks to me like he's working in the good faith of the prosecution.
Suttle says Harlan is part of a much larger problem around the country. Forensic specialists who critics say stack the evidence for the police and the prosecution, hoping to stay employed.
Why might there be a tendency to side with the prosecution?
You work with them, you want to be a good guy, you want to be a buddy-buddy. And unfortunately, this is not only happens here, it happens in many cases. But you can't do that. I mean, at least you shouldn't do that, let's put it this way.
The accusation is that Dr. Harlan tailored his testimony to benefit the prosecution.
That's right.
Did you know him as a man who would do that?
No. Although I will have to say his testimony in this case right here was incredible, in my opinion.
You mean unbelievable?
I'm not going to use that term, but it's close. It's close.
The criticism of Dr. Harlan now is that he worked so closely with the prosecution that he told the court what the prosecution wanted him to say.
Well, we didn't do that. So I don't know whether anybody else, whether that happened in any other situation, but it never happened in any case that I was involved in.
Do you think Dr. Harlan was trying to tell the prosecution what they wanted to hear?
Probably.
That's not good.
No, it's not good. You ought to just tell what you did, and you can give an opinion if you got one.
Harlan could never have been put behind bars because Tennessee, like some other states, gives medical examiners immunity from prosecution.
In Tennessee, medical examiners get immunity. There's no way to punish this man for what he did.
That's what I don't understand. How can somebody be above the law?
Maddie DeLone is with the Innocence Project. What's harder to understand, she says, is why the state of Tennessee didn't review all of Dr. Harlan's cases.
That's just putting your head in the sand. And
Organs that this dog eat.
The liver and the
not wanting to sort of understand the full implication of the problem.
How many autopsies did you perform?
Many thousands. The most I did in one day was 10.
In one day?
In one day.
There's no reason to believe that somebody who's capable of these acts that are clearly negligent isn't capable of more of them. We should insist that there be independent audits of these kinds of errors and that people go back, and if they need to, they look at all of the cases.
But Dr. Harlan had been testifying for 30 years. How many other mistakes had he made? James Suttle is convinced that there are still men in prison today who were wrongfully convicted based on Harlan's evidence.
But I mean, if you look at the odds and the probabilities, it's pretty hard to say that there's not somebody else that was in my same shoes that wasn't as fortunate as I was.
Might there be other men, women, in prison, sent there because of these types of erroneous...
Oh, unfortunately, yes.
And 2020 may have found two of them. James Dellinger and Gary Sutton are on death row right now, based in part on Dr. Harlan's testimony. Could these men win a new trial? And will Dr. Harlan respond to the charges?
Dr. Harlan, these men were on trial for their lives. There was no evidence, no motive, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. And yet you felt comfortable testifying to something that goes against medical literature.
When 2020 returns.
Not wanting to sort of understand.
Gary Sutton and James Dellinger have been on Tennessee's death row since 1996. Police say they killed their friend Tommy Griffin here at the swimming hole with a shotgun back in 1992 after bailing him out of jail on a Friday night.
Why would they bail him out of jail and then kill him?
That was a question we asked.
Former defense lawyers F.D. Gibson and Eugene Dixon said their clients had been in trouble with the law before.
James Dellinger, your client, he wasn't an angel.
Oh, no.
Capable of murder?
When you look at his history, he was a roughneck, but crimes of violence were not in his background. And they weren't in the background of Gary Sutton either.
Like the case of James Suttle, the evidence against Dellinger and Sutton was almost entirely circumstantial.
Was there any evidence tying Mr. Sutton to this murder?
there's no physical evidence. There's no fingerprints. They found no ballistics.
No gun, no weapon,
No weapon,
no witnesses,
No witnesses.
no motive.
no motive.
As a matter of fact, that was one of our strong arguments. Mr. Sutton had no motive because Mr. Griffin and he were like brothers.
And like the case of James Suttle, everything hinged on the time of death.
The prosecution's case depended on this murder occurring Friday night.
That's correct.
If Dellinger and Sutton were responsible, the only time they could have killed Griffin was right after they bailed him out of jail Friday night.
They had alibis the next day, the day before that. People had seen them.
But defense lawyers saw an apparent problem with the state's theory. When the body was discovered 3 days later, the wound seemed fresh, according to first responders.
And in the crime scene photos, you still see the blood,
Yes.
red and fresh.
The body would be dead 3 days. It'd be dried up and caked.
Even more puzzling, when the body was discovered, according to EMS workers, it was still in full rigor mortis.
They got picked up. They said he was so stiff they couldn't get him in the ambulance.
Rigor mortis is a stiffening of the body that begins after death and then gradually goes away. Forensic expert Bill Bass explains.
It runs for, 24 hours, maybe 18 hours, something like that. And then it begins to fade away, to dissipate.
The body relaxes.
The body relaxes, that's right.
For the defense lawyers, the fact that Griffin was still in full rigor mortis 3 days after he was supposedly killed completely exonerated their clients.
They said he was so stiff that they didn't get him on the stretcher.
A forensic expert for the defense testified there was no way Griffin was killed on Friday because rigor mortis should be completely gone 36 hours after death. When the defense rested, the attorneys were pretty confident.
So you thought you had the trial won.
And when we got through the case on a Friday night, we felt pretty good about it.
That night, according to defense lawyers, the prosecutors renewed a previous offer, a reduced sentence in exchange for a guilty plea.
The prosecution offered you a plea deal.
Yeah, they did.
And even though your clients were facing the death penalty, they wouldn't take that plea deal.
No, they wouldn't.
Why not?
Said they didn't do it.
But then, the next day, an unexpected figure on the witness stand.
Along comes a surprise witness.
Along comes Dr. Harlan Saturday morning at 9 o'clock.
Dr. Harlan told jurors the defense expert was wrong. He said full rigor mortis can last 3 days and that the blood on a body 3 days old can still be bright red and wet to the touch.
You were blindsided.
We were blindsided.
At the heart of Dr. Harlan's testimony was this claim that rigor mortis lasts 72 hours.
Right, and the two experts disagreed.
You feel that it contradicted all known science.
Subsequent investigation shows that it was basically hogwash.
But that day in 1996, the two public defenders had no time and no money to hire a rebuttal witness. They could only watch helplessly as judge and jury sentenced their clients to death.
When you hear the jury's verdict, guilty, how did you feel?
I was looking for a hole to get into and bury myself.
But what about Dr. Harlan's history of botched cases?
He was under investigation at the time by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for incompetence. Did you know that?
No, we did not know that.
Should they have told you?
Under the laws, they should have told us. Because they're presenting this man as an expert witness, and if he is under investigation and has in fact been fired for incompetence, that would certainly undermine his credibility.
The district attorney in the case denies that he knew.
How would you describe Charles Harlan today?
A hired gun. He testifies for whoever pays him.
Should Mr. Sutton be put to death?
No. Not in my opinion.
Why not?
I don't think he did it.
When we come back, we ask Charles Harlan what he was thinking. Could he have helped send innocent men to death row? And what about all those bodies? When 2020 returns. Since rested, the attorneys were pretty confident. Two men on death row since 1996.
This February will be 18 years.
Their families still hoping against hope that what they think is a wrong might be righted.
We all believe that. Yes.
Their husbands and loved ones put on death row in good part by the testimony of one man, Dr. Harlan. Could his testimony have been wrong?
Is he a competent expert?
If you'd asked me back yonder in 1996, I would say, I don't know, he's a chief medical examiner. Now I think he's a blight on the medical profession.
Charles Harlan, now stripped of his medical license, lives in Arkansas, where he says he coaches Little League Baseball. We decided it was time to confront him about the serious charges made against him.
Dr. Harlan, these men were on trial for their lives. There was no evidence, no motive, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. It all depended on what you said.
I don't recall the case at all.
You don't remember? It was a big deal.
I don't remember it.
Dr. Harlan didn't seem to remember a lot of things during this interview.
You had also been barred from the crime lab, the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation.
I'm not aware of that.
We have a copy saying that you were barred from the lab. And Dr. George Nichols, do you know that name?
I do.
Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Kentucky, warned that if your work continued with your line of what he called irrational thinking, then, in the words of Dr. Nichols, God help you and the rest of the citizens of the state of Tennessee.
I'm unaware of that.
And though he says he doesn't remember the case of Dellinger and Sutton, Charles Harlan still maintains his testimony in the case was correct.
72 hours after the person dies, you could still be in rigor mortis?
That's correct.
You're aware that some of the world's renowned experts say full rigor mortis only lasts 24 to 36 hours.
It depends on which references you go to.
Last month, 3 different experts testified that Dr. Harlan's testimony about rigor mortis in this case was not medically possible. New lawyers for Sutton and Dellinger are currently appealing the death penalty conviction based in good part on questions about Dr. Harlan's testimony that day.
Is it possible? These men are now on death row. Is it possible that you could have made a mistake?
I don't recall anything about the case.
The current medical examiner of Tennessee, Dr. Bruce Levy, defends the reputation of his office, saying rigor mortis can be affected by outside temperatures. He says it remains medically possible that the murder took place 3 days before.
The problem is there's no mathematical formula to plug in and come out with an exact number.
But he's very careful about how he says it.
If I was just going to base a conviction on when I thought the time of death might be, I'd be very nervous about doing that.
And then there's the issue of Dr. Harlan's credibility. At trial, defense lawyers say Harlan misled the jury by implying that he was still the medical examiner of Tennessee.
Was that actually true at that time?
I was the chief medical examiner for the state from 1989 to 1995.
Mm-hmm. But you had already been fired on June 30th of 95.
I have no recollection of the case at all.
Do you think the opposing counsel, the defense, should have been told that you were under investigation or that you were barred from the TBI?
No.
Dr. Harlan was reluctant to talk about the acts that led to his losing his license.
You're familiar with the charges against us? There's 23 charges.
I am.
How would you characterize them?
I don't think that's the proper discussion for this interview.
But it sheds light on your work, or it brings questions, certainly. You misidentified a dead body as that of a man who was wanted for multiple crimes, and then that guy turns up alive 2 years later. Remember that case?
That's not the topic of this interview.
In 2 other cases, you said kids, children, babies died of SIDS. But later autopsies revealed that both children had been murdered. In one case, by a cocaine overdose, and in the other one, by abuse. How could you miss that? You don't have an answer for that? The other charge is that your dog ate one of the body's spleen, and then he also ate a kidney. Is that true? Dr. Harlan, you don't want to respond?
I've already responded. That's not the purpose of this interview.
But it sheds light on who you may or may not be. You can deny this if it's not true.
It's never happened to me in an ABC News interview before or since, but Charles Harlan fell completely silent. He didn't get up and leave. He just simply stopped talking.
Is there anything that you'd like to say about all of this, any of this? These are charges that are on the record, and as a reporter, I'm just asking you. It is an opportunity for you to set the record straight. Would you rather we just end the interview here?
Yes.
Could Gary Sutton and James Dellinger have been sentenced to death based on incorrect testimony? Their former lawyers say there's only one way to know for sure.
What do you want for your client?
A new trial is about the best he's going to get.
And the only remedy that I know of that is a new trial.
A judge is expected to rule on that soon. Meanwhile, James Suttle, an expert on the odds, says he'll give you 20-1 that there are still other innocent men in prison because of Dr. Harlan. And he says, there, but for the grace of God, go I.
But you were innocent.
Yeah, well, even though I was innocent, if I hadn't had good representation, it wouldn't have mattered, innocent or guilty. I've been sent in the penitentiary. I look at it different now than I did before, because I know it can happen. It can happen to anyone. It happened to me.
James Settle learned that lesson the hard way. Well, that's it for the first hour of 20.